with a relatively small production budget of just 55 million, but going on to make just over 196 million at the box office. It's fair to say that Stargate was something of a hit. And while sadly a sequel never materialised, several spin-off TV shows did go on to have a long and healthy lifespan on the small screen. And on the face of it, the film Stargate lends itself nicely to an action figure line. There's action, adventure, likeable heroes, and plenty of aliens. And toy company Hasbro must have been thinking the same thing, because they commissioned a line of Stargate action figures to support the initial release of this film. The line was ultimately fairly short-lived with just the one wave, but it was actually quite a packed out wave with plenty of vehicles to support an expanding world. And to be fair, they covered most of the toyetic characters from the film anyway. So today on Flashback Friday, I thought it would be fun to take a trip back through the Stargate. So let's start the packaging for the single carded figures. As we can see, they had a fairly simple bubble packaging design, and they employed some really nice artwork. In the background we have the Stargate, and out the Stargate we have the character jumping out at us, and it looks really striking, very nicely illustrated and very colourful and fun. On the reverse we'd have a star field, and then we'd see all the other characters available in this line. Rather than opting for photographs of the actual figures themselves, they've just decided to put all the illustrated images, which in hindsight actually is really nice and displayable and attractive. At the bottom of the packaging though, we have this unusual triangle, and we can see there's definitely an experimental approach to what to do with the empty space on this packaging. So we have this triangle, we have that self-same image of the character again replicated here, underneath which there is a little bit of bio about the character, which is nice, and the idea I think is that you cut this triangle out, add it to the other characters in the collection, and build your own pyramid. I have no idea what this looks like when it's fully assembled, but I can't imagine it's that impressive, to be honest, and certainly not worth destroying the packaging for. There's also a strange little quiz where you can kind of decode or decipher the hieroglyphics to get the answer to the question, which is a fun idea, I suppose. Now, one of my favourite things about this line is that they actually produced 4 villains, and 3 of which are the Horus guards that we see in the film. The 2 you can see here is the Palace Guard and the Attack Pilot, but they also did one in a green outfit called Anubis. Now, these figures are quite a lot of fun. They're certainly nicely sculpted and nicely painted, and each one has its own distinct identity because of the colours they've used and the skin tone on each figure. Sadly though, one of the things that lets these toys down is the headpieces. Now, these are a separate piece that can be removed, which is pretty cool, but you will notice they have these rather unseemly and completely unnecessary eye slits so that the eyes can peep out through the helmet. But other than that, the helmets themselves are actually quite nicely moulded and sculpted. They look pretty screen accurate, if we ignore that big gap of course. As I said though, you can remove the helmets if you want, just like in the film, so you have the humanoid appearance underneath, which is pretty cool. Again, you can see these are very distinctly different from one another. There is a different sculpt applied to each figure to give them their own sense of character and identity, which is great. And we can see this individualism continue throughout the costume. The gauntlets, the belts, the shoes that they wear or boots that they wear are completely different from one another. Now, being 90s toys, they do have a fairly simple articulation scheme, and it is the same across every figure in this line. There is a swivel at the neck allowing the head to spin right the way around. There's another point at the shoulder allowing the arm to lift up and down and go right the way around if you want it to. And then there is a final one at each hip allowing the leg to lift up and down. The accessories vary from figure to figure, but one thing you can pretty much guarantee with any of the Horus guards is that they're going to come with a staff weapon, some sort of missile firing shoulder cannon, some kind of scaled down ornament from the film. It might be a pyramid or the sarcophagus. I'm really pleased that we get these staff weapons because these are pretty screen accurate for the most part and are very authentic, which is brilliant. The shoulder cannons and the missile firing weapons, not so much so. These are inventions of Hasbro, and I can certainly understand the impulse. At the end of the day, it's fun to have a firing weapon and just give these figures a little bit extra oomph that you couldn't really do or replicate with the staff weapon given its size and shape. Probably my favourite of all of these figures is the main villain, Ra. Here he is in all his royal splendour, and although it's not quite accurate to what we see on screen, I think they've done a fairly decent job of transcribing this into toy form. Just like the Horus gods, he also has a removable headdress as well. And I have to say, I really like the sculpt they've gone with here, and the fact that they decided to paint the figure gold just lends it a bit more visual interest. Just like the others in this line, he does of course come with his own cannon and firing missile. It looks even more ridiculous in Ra's hand than it does in the Horus God's hands, but hey, it was the 90s, they had to have a big gun. So what about the human characters, the heroes of the film? Well, I'm afraid I have to say, they fare less well. Whilst the card art for these figures shows the illustration being pretty faithful to the actor's likeness, the head sculpts do not. In fact, there doesn't even seem to be any attempt to make them look like the characters in the film. Daniel Jackson here, of course, has short hair and seems to have a much more muscular frame than he does in the film. He's also jam-packed with weapons, which we don't really see that much of in the film. Poor Scarre doesn't fare much better either. The likeness between the actor and the action figure are worlds apart. But on the plus side, they do at least give him a little hat. Whilst Daniel comes saddled with this rather hefty backpack, but to their credit, Hasbro did give every figure a distinctly unique mould. There's no recycled parts here, everything is different. We can see this especially when we look at the legs of these figures. And of course they gave these characters a lot more earthbound weapons. Of course the line also had a Colonel Jack O'Neill figure as played by Kurt Russell, but again suffers from the same likeness issues as the other figures in the line. We also had a Lieutenant Kowalski and of course Anubis. Now I did mention that aside from doing a healthy action figure line, they also supported this line with some vehicles, and in this case we have the Winged Glider, my personal favourite of all the vehicles produced in this line, because it is head and shoulders above everything else. The packaging is quite fun, and surprisingly they've dedicated almost the entire space to the illustration, which is rather wonderful. We have these gliders in space, even though that's technically inaccurate, it's still a very nice visual, and of course we have those rockets firing, and it looks really fun and colourful. The reverse of the packaging is also quite sparse. It just has a sort of schematic of the vehicle pointing out some of the various action features, and there aren't a lot really, so it does look a little bit bland and a little bit simplistic, but the glider itself is very nicely moulded and sculpted. It is pretty screen accurate to what we see in the film, which is great. I always really like the look of this design of this ship. I think it's really visually interesting. But that said, there's not an awful lot to it in truth. It is all essentially one piece. There's not really much in the way of moving parts. There's a couple of extra cannons that we can strap on, and there's a bit of a railing around the outer edge that you can stick in there to give it a bit of texture and depth, which is nice. And there's a couple of little stickers here and there peppered throughout the vehicle to give it a bit more colour. It's very nice that at the reverse of the vehicle that we have this big green section, which just adds a little bit of extra brightness to this vehicle, because otherwise it is quite a dull dark blue. The mounted cannons are quite fun. They're a bit more oversized than we see in the film, but they are a nice purple which contrasts nicely against the blue, and they come with these very luminous, transparent neon yellow missiles. And I have to say they've been very generous with the amount of missiles they've given us, because there's not just one for every cannon, there's actually an extra 4 spare. And they can be loosely mounted somewhat awkwardly on the sides of the vehicle, which again gives it a splash of colour, which is nice, but they don't really hold in place if you want it to move. And aside from the 2 shoulder cannons that go on the shoulders of the wings of the glider, there's also an additional 2 underneath the glider as well. So this is feeling fully loaded and ready for battle. The cockpit is open, but inside we have some nice gold and shiny stickers in here, and this is a nice touch because there's certain Egyptian hieroglyphics on it, and they're different colours. We see green, red, black, gold, and this makes it look pretty attractive. It's just interesting that these are on the inside of the cockpit, which we don't really see a lot of the time. Now interestingly, on the box art we have the palace guard pictured flying the ship, as opposed to the attack pilot. But it doesn't matter which you use, because essentially you can place them into the cockpit. They both fit in very comfortably, and they look pretty good. This looks like a pretty sensible scale and roughly compares to what we see on screen. Now of course we also have the missiles, which are spring loaded, and let me tell you, when you fire them they go at quite a pace, and if you're not careful they could do some serious damage to your collection. And for the sake of contrast, here is the attack pilot in the cockpit. Now, you will notice that if you put these figures in with their rubber skirts still attached, then they're not going to be able to sit into the cockpit. But they have made those skirts removable for this very purpose, so they will sit in quite comfortably. And just because I love firing these rockets, here they are again. Now underneath the glider you'll notice there is this tiny little fin. This is for you to grip so that you can hold onto the glider and fly it around your living room or wherever you have your toys. And this works surprisingly well. It actually means there's no compromise to the look or style of the vehicle or to the mould, and it manages to stand freely on its wings by itself when it's at rest, which is absolutely fantastic. And I think it looks pretty cool and it's pretty fun to fly around. Now, aside from the glider, they also released the all-terrain cruiser, which is basically a desert jeep. Now, I got to be honest, I don't remember this actually being in the film, but nevertheless, the artwork on the front of the box is pretty exciting and action-packed. It kind of makes sense for this film to have these characters zooming around with a big cannon on the top there. It's kind of fun. But the strangest release in this line has to be the Mastage, the Beast of Burden. In the film, you may remember there is that big alien camel thing, which is sort of a cross between a camel and a woolly mammoth and a bull, I suppose. Well, that is the Mastage, and they decided to make a toy of that, but not a great one. I think they've done a pretty good job of the artwork on the box to try and make it look as exciting as possible, but there's not an awful lot to this figure. When you look at these images, you basically have an immobile one-piece mould with no articulation at all, a rather clumpy big piece of hair coming out the top as a mane, which looks a little bit unkempt, a bit untidy, and then it has this harness that you can strap on the back of it where I suppose it could carry goods or an action figure. I've got to say, this has to be the biggest miss of the entire line and a real head scratcher because it just doesn't look very fun, does it? And judging by the sculpt on the poor Mastage's face, it looks like even he wants to be put out of his misery. And so there you have it, there's a whistle-stop tour of the entire line dedicated to the Stargate movie. It wasn't uncommon in the 90s for every major film to get its own toy line, usually running to just one wave of toys because they weren't that popular, the film wasn't that successful, whatever it might have been. And I think Stargate kind of fell into that a little bit. But that said, I think we actually have a pretty decent collection here. I can't really think of what other characters could have been produced or what other vehicles could have been produced that weren't produced as part of this line. I think what we have in the most part is pretty fun. It definitely suffers from real poor likenesses when it comes to the major actors, the human characters in the film. But that said, for a child audience in the 90s, I think this certainly did the job. And I had a lot of fun with these toys. And in particular, the standout for me is that glider, because even today I think it's a really cool, fun toy and surprisingly screen accurate for the day and age. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.